New Democratic Dimensions presents Living Up to JFK's Challenge in Today's World. Hi, I'm Howard Teach, founding chair of New Democratic Dimensions, joined by my co-chair, Lori Sutton. New Democratic Dimensions is hosting today's retrospective of JFK 60 years later, featuring his extraordinary commencement speech on peace at American University on June 10th, 1963. This forum is designed to reflect upon President Kennedy's timeless message and to trace its enduring relevance for today's world as we contemplate our path forward as a nation and as a world.
Each generation faces its own particular issues for which the lessons of history may be summoned to offer insight and illumination. As we are again facing the prospect of a nuclear war on the horizon, JFK's timeless wisdom and admonition to look inward and actively seek peace emerges again as the pressing challenge of our time. And now we will witness President Kennedy as he delivers his momentous speech at American University, whose leadership compiled this brief video to mark the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's 1963 speech.
It is with great pride that I participate in this ceremony of the American University. I have chosen this time and place to discuss the most important topic on earth, peace. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
I graduated from American University in June of 1963. It was a very tense year.
It came on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You know, we grew up being afraid of a nuclear bomb.
There might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then you're on your own.
You just knew that every Russian was bad, and they wanted to destroy the world. There was no talk. If they hit us, we were going to hit them, and bango.
The communist world was demonstrating its collective image of belligerence, power, and solidarity.
President Kennedy brought in a whole new view of things.
He was adored. He was loved around the world. He'd already delivered that incredible inaugural address.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
His call upon us as citizens to step forward, to be engaged, to look outward, began to create an excitement.
He chose American University because American University had already developed a reputation for public service, for reaching out across the United States and across the world for students and faculty.
So it was very, very exciting that he was going to speak at the graduation, at my graduation.
Every graduate of this school who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace. Too many think it is unreal, but that is a dangerous, defeatist belief.
What I remember was that it was an extremely important speech.
This is Marvin Kell, Moscow correspondent, CBS News, Vienna.
In my judgment, even looking back upon it now, I think it's the best speech he ever gave.
We've never fought a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and he held out an olive branch.
It was really out of step with the times. We were in a very martial attitude towards the Soviet Union. We'd just come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and here was a president saying we should focus on peace, not victory, and coexistence, and respect.
And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue.
In those days, the word of a president of the United States was big stuff, and it was regarded as a big deal not only in the U.S. but all over the world.
It's remarkable. At the height of the Cold War, President Kennedy's speech was translated and broadcast almost in its entirety in Russian, the Soviet Union.
We really were talking to the Russians.
And certainly no one was expecting the blockbuster announcement that came.
I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so.
The speech represented Kennedy's way of taking the world beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis into a new era.
And the way to do it was parley, find a way to compromise.
The president said, this country will not be the first to resume nuclear testing. He said such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty. But he said, I hope it will help us achieve one. This is Roger Mudd in Washington.
The speech was June of '63, the treaty was August, and he said it was his greatest accomplishment.
I think the big takeaway from the Kennedy speech is about the engagement with adversaries, not only to get to a place of better security, but better understanding.
President Kennedy was trying to look beyond antagonistic speech, trying to show the importance of judgment, the importance of taking the other into account.
He caused all of us to think differently, think more inclusively.
I think I was very, very directly inspired by that speech.
It was a moment of arrival for the university, a point at which the university's reputation was on the rise.
I will find myself lecturing either in India or Brazil or Australia, and American University, the speech.
At this point, where the university is with the programs to bring the awareness of the global community to our students and to involve them is a result of some of the things that occurred here on campus the day that he made the announcement.
Genuine peace must be the
Product of many nations, the sum of many acts.
It must be dynamic,
not static, changing to meet the challenge
of each new generation.
For peace is a process,
a way of solving problems.
Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
"60 years later, we have a responsibility to honor President Kennedy's poignant plea, raising the question of why countries cannot fight for peace with the same vigor as they fight for war, summoning his courage to address the moral and ethical dimensions of this imperative."
Panel participants will share their unique perspectives and renew a dialogue that is intended to continue far beyond this event and stimulate public discussions influencing decision makers and citizens of all generations. Please join us now, led by our four uniquely qualified panelists, Jeffrey Sachs, Kerry Kennedy, Gillian Sorensen, and Hill Harper, as we open ourselves to live up to JFK's challenge in today's world. Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned economist, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. In addition to his pioneering global work on the control of AIDS, malaria, COVID-19, and other diseases, the battle against human-induced climate change, and the fight to end poverty, Dr. Sachs wrote the 2013 book, To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, marking the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's speech at American University. Kerry Kennedy is president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, a legendary organization which partners with the bravest people on earth to create lasting change. A human rights activist and lawyer whose intrepid global work spans over 4 decades, the 7th of Ethel and Robert F. Kennedy's 11 children, and the proud mother of 3 amazing daughters. She authored the New York Times bestseller, Being Catholic Now, as well as Speak Truth to Power and Robert F. Kennedy, Ripples of Hope.
And now I introduce Gillian Sorensen, described by the New York Times as the diplomat's diplomat, special advisor for public policy at the United Nations, where she had a distinguished career, and national advocate for the UN Foundation, having worked closely with 3 secretaries general with diplomats from 193 nations and with 4,000 non-governmental organizations accredited to the UN. She continues to inspire with her commitment to peace, justice, human rights, and humanitarian and refugee release. She is the widow of Ted Sorensen, who was special counsel and speechwriter for President Kennedy. Hill Harper, an acclaimed actor, author, advisor, entrepreneur, and activist. Many know him for his role of Dr. Sheldon Hawkes in the TV drama CSI New York. Founder of the award-winning Manifest Your Destiny Foundation, dedicated to empowering underserved youth. His myriad achievements include serving as the national spokesman for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, be the architect, launching the Black Wall Street, a digital tool aimed at addressing the racial wealth gap, and advising the White House on cancer policy. A leading light in Indiana and in America, Hill Harper. And now I turn you over to these 4 distinguished Americans who will lead us both in 4-minute presentations and then in a wonderful conversation, which will be emceed by Kerry Kennedy. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very much. It's very moving to be part of this discussion and also to be at the 60th anniversary of the most important speech in modern times. I wrote a book about this speech 10 years ago on the 50th anniversary because I thought it was crucial to avoiding global war. And now, 10 years later, we're closer to the precipice, and the speech is even more vital, more alive, more relevant, more essential than ever. It's important to understand the context of this speech. This speech was given a little more than half a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis that nearly ended the world. We came within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation. We truly did. President Kennedy knew it. His counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, knew it. And they spent bravely and remarkably 1963 to pull us back from the precipice, and did so successfully. This speech was a remarkable part of that effort. It is glorious, it is wise, it is eloquent, it is moving, it is practical, it's extraordinarily important. And it played a decisive role in events because the speech was indeed so remarkable in its eloquence, to be sure, but also in its practical insights that Nikita Khrushchev, upon hearing the speech, summoned the American envoy, Averell Harriman, and said, your president has given the finest speech since FDR. I think I would say without qualification, but this is Khrushchev saying to the US envoy then in Moscow, I want to make peace with your president. And a few weeks after that, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed. And soon after that, it was ratified by the US Senate by an overwhelming majority of 80 to 19. The American people wanted peace, and they responded to President Kennedy's call for peace. This was at the height of the Cold War. It showed that even at the height of the Cold War, it was possible to reach across the divide and make peace. It's possible now. Again, we could end the war in Ukraine through negotiations now, using the guidance of this speech. I just want to highlight a few points that I find extraordinarily important and extraordinarily moving. I'll be brief. Everybody should read the speech, listen to the speech, think about the speech, but I want to highlight a few of the points that I think are essential. President Kennedy says, "I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men." Not warfare, not who can have the best arms race, but peace as the necessary rational end. To do so, as you heard in the clip, I believe we must re-examine our own attitude, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. We're great at finger pointing. We're not very good at understanding our own role and our own attitudes. There is no single simple key to this peace. As we heard the young people say, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. Absolutely crucial. One of the great statements about leadership, which exemplified President Kennedy's leadership, is his thought: by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all peoples to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. In other words, define how the goals can be accomplished. The path to peace in Ukraine, what's specific, how to do it, sit down, be rational, understand the other side, reach an agreement. Of course, no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. Very important. One extraordinary statement, which we ought to have thought about every single day now, because we do almost exactly the opposite every day. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. We go out to humiliate Russia every day now. It's unbelievable in our press, in the drumbeats of war, in statements by senior officials. Stop the humiliation. Stop putting adversaries to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. That is a death wish. Then President Kennedy laid out specifics of how we were going to reach an agreement, and a few weeks later, we did. And I want to recall a couple of other things that President Kennedy said for us in closing. First, in that campaign for peace in the summer of 1963, when President Kennedy spoke a few weeks after this speech in the Irish Parliament, another amazing, wondrous speech, he said, "Indeed, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet." And finally, I'd like to recall the words of the inaugural address itself. "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am honored to join this distinguished group as we remember a historic moment 60 years ago. And that, of course, is the famous peace speech delivered by President John F. Kennedy at the American University commencement. It was a very difficult time, enormous tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. Still within a year past was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the president took that opportunity to speak about peace as real and possible, about a peace where both sides could be winners. It had relevance then, and indeed it does today. As we consider the American attitudes toward peace, back then he defined peace with eloquence and idealism as, in some ways, a practical matter, that steps needed to be taken to move that direction, and those were absolutely real and possible. Above all, President Kennedy did not demean or demonize or insult the Soviet Union or Nikita Khrushchev. In fact, he expressed respect and for their power and their achievements in science and space and the arts, and especially respect for the role that the Soviet Union played as one of our allies in World War II, when the Soviets lost 20 million soldiers. Apparently, Khrushchev was so moved and impressed that he had the speech broadcast and printed throughout the country. And he committed to sign the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was done some months later. It was a policy of détente and respectful outreach that had lasting impact. My late husband, Ted Sorensen, was Kennedy's speechwriter and spoke of this particular speech as the most important one he ever worked on. He gathered from the president what his focus was, his goal, the theme, the spirit of it, and worked hard on the speech over a period of days. The president had headed out to Hawaii for a conference of mayors. Ted then joined him, and they flew back overnight, working on the final details and adjustments of the speech, and went straight to the American University commencement. It was, as Ted said, not just to inform and to inspire, but to open eyes and to bring hope. The language, when I look at it today, is very understandable. It is elevated, but it's not grandiose. There is the typical rhyming and repetition and alliteration. And I will say that Ted, who was in the audience, felt so powerfully moved that this important, indeed critical issue was conveyed with the president's unique speaking power. It was apparently received very well with praise around the world, and its influence and impact changed life, certainly in the next decades. But as we read it today with fresh eyes, it does apply today as well. And I was so glad to read also in Jeffrey Sachs' brilliant book about this, To Move the World, that the president spoke just 3 months later in the United Nations, and again on the subject of peace, and again saying that the UN as an organization needs to be reinforced, and we all need to play our role in its success. So it is a meaningful speech, both 60 years ago and now. And in the speech is one short quotation that is my favorite from any of Kennedy's speeches, and I will share it with you. Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Howard Teach, the founder of New Democratic Dimensions, and my great friends Gillian Sorensen and Jeffrey Sachs, and the actor Hill Harper, who has been so very generous to Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights over the years. My name is Carrie Kennedy, and I'm the president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Much has been said about Uncle Jack's speech at American University 60 years ago, his urging us to build institutions of peace, his urging us to believe a just peace is not a mere pipe dream, but within our reach, his concern that war starts because of a misunderstanding or miscalculation about the enemy, his urging us to have a greater understanding of the very real fear of war felt by the citizens of the Soviet Union, a country which as Gillian just pointed out, sustained the loss of 20 million people over World War II, the decimation of a third of their country, equivalent to a total loss of everything east of Chicago in the United States. His vision of a world not only free of nuclear weapons, but of all weapons. Think about that, of all weapons, so that we can divert that funding to anti-poverty programs and healthcare and education, and his willingness to take unilateral action towards that goal. Just extraordinary. Rereading his words of 60 years ago, one cannot help but see the parallels we are grappling with today. And I'd like to take a few minutes to put into context Uncle Jack's experience with war and peace as President of the United States, which informed his approach to war and to making that speech. His commitment to peace grew out of an unmitigated disaster of having the PT boat he was commanding split in two by a Japanese destroyer during World War II, losing two shipmates, swimming 3.5 miles while dragging an injured sailor who was wearing a safety flotation device, and he was holding the tether of that device in his teeth while swimming 3.5 miles and saving the lives of the rest of his crew. He knew firsthand the trauma of war. And despite the aggressive Cold War palaver that Jack used during his campaign rhetoric and to some extent in his inaugural address, his greatest ambition as president was to keep the peace. In his inaugural address, again and again at the UN, he said, "We have the capacity to make this the best generation in history of mankind or the last." He told Ben Bradley, who was one of his closest friends, that he wanted his epitaph to be, "He kept the peace." His Defense Department Secretary, Robert McNamara, commented later, quote, "I think his view was that his primary responsibility as President of the United States was to keep this country out of war, if at all possible," unquote. Think about that in terms of all the presidents since. And McNamara admitted that Jack succeeded under the most adverse circumstances, surrounded as he was by warmongering generals, congressional hawks, and a highly militarized Washington establishment, all convinced that war with the Soviets was not only inevitable, but was desirable. At the beginning of his administration, Jack met with Khrushchev in Vienna and brought him a small model of old Ironsides. The ship Grandma Rose used to take her children and us, her grandchildren, to sea in Boston Harbor. Pointing to the cannons, Jack said that in those days, you could see the person you were shooting. But today, we could shoot over great distances and kill millions or even hundreds of millions of people, both innocents as well as military, and that we had to take on a new moral responsibility towards the powers that our nations were yielding. He was surprised by Khrushchev's reaction. Khrushchev was bombastic, pugnacious, and unwilling to negotiate or move. Jack went back to the United States badly shaken. During the summer of 1961, the US military, under the direction of General Lucius Clay, took a series of unauthorized proactive actions against the Soviets along the Berlin Wall. This culminated on October 27, 1961, when Soviet and US tanks loaded with live munitions faced one another at Checkpoint Charlie, the line dividing East and West Berlin. On September 29, 1961, Khrushchev wrote Jack a letter, the first of 26 secret letters between the two of them. It was smuggled to Jack by Georgy Bolshakov, which he handed to Pierre Salinger, folded into a copy of the New York Times. Bolshakov was a KGB spy who used to frequent Hickory Hill, our home in Northern Virginia. He was a bon vivant, and he used to delight us kids by doing traditional Russian dances. And my mother would egg him on to have push-up contests against my father. The CIA was horrified that we would let somebody who was a known spy into our house. But with the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev began using him to end run the KGB and the military establishment. The letter was essentially an apology for Vienna. Khrushchev sent his letter from his Black Sea retreat, his dacha. And in it, Khrushchev mentioned the Bible, writing, "We're all on this ark together. And no matter whether we are clean or unclean, we all have an interest in having the ark continue to float." Jack took that biblical imagery and replied to Khrushchev on October 16th from his desk in Hyannisport, which is where I am now, looking out over the field where we played baseball every day. Jack described Hyannisport as a place where his children played with their cousins, saying that we all had a moral interest in making sure that innocent people like our children were not incinerated by thermonuclear mistakes made by hard-headed politicians. In his second letter, Khrushchev said, "I have no ground to retreat further. There is a precipice behind me." Jack understood at that point that Khrushchev was in the exact situation that he was in. They both were confronting their own military and intelligence complex that was intent on going to war. Jack understood Khrushchev's predicament and gave him the room he needed. He told him at the time, "If you withdraw your tanks, I'll withdraw mine within 20 minutes." Jack said to his advisors at that time, who wanted him to launch attacks on Russians, "I am not going to go to war over driving rights on the Autobahn." In the aftermath of the crisis, General Lucius Clay called Jack a traitor for not using the atomic bomb on the Soviets. In Vietnam, Jack again found himself in pitched battle with his own advisor, drumming for war. In 1951, he and my father visited Vietnam and witnessed the futility of French efforts against the determination of the Vietnamese people. When he returned to Washington, he isolated himself from his congressional colleagues with his outspoken opposition to the hopeless internecine struggle. As president, Jack was determined not to become embroiled in a war there. When Jack became president, we had 685 military advisors in Vietnam. From the start, he was under constant pressure to put ground troops in, but that pressure was no match for his own convictions. By the time he died, we had committed no ground troops. He did send 16,000 advisors, 4,000 fewer than the 20,000 troops he sent to Old Miss. Meanwhile, his most trusted friends and advisors from the national security team, including General Maxwell Taylor, Bob McNamara, McNamara's deputy Roswell Kilpatrick, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, his ambassador to Vietnam, Frederick Bolton Jr., every one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his entire intelligence apparatus, along with the New York Times and virtually every other newspaper in the country, advised him strongly to send ground troops to Vietnam. Reflecting on it later, General Taylor observed, quote, "I don't recall anyone who was strongly against sending combat troops to Vietnam except one man, and that was the president," unquote. Jack feared an election loss to the warmongering Republicans if he brought the American advisors home right away. The morning he left for Dallas, he received the report that 78 American men had died in Vietnam, and he was visibly shaken. On May 8, 1962, Jack ordered McNamara to devise a plan for bringing all American troops home from Vietnam. On October 11, 1963, 5 weeks before his death, Jack bypassed his own National Security Council and he issued National Security Action Memorandum 263, making official government policy the withdrawal from Vietnam of the bulk of U.S. military personnel by the end of 1965, beginning with 1,000 U.S. military by December 1963. Indeed, the first 1,000 advisors came home by the end of that year. And then with his death, they were just as quickly replaced. In Cuba, Jack again resisted the hardliners intent on going to war, first during the Bay of Pigs and later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Bay of Pigs, CIA Director Allen Dulles and Deputy Director Richard Bissell assured Jack that the invasion of Cuba would succeed because the US-backed forces were superior to the Cuban forces, and Castro was wildly unpopular. We now know that Dulles and Bissell said that to the president, knowing both statements were untrue. But they believed that a young, inexperienced president faced with military defeat only 3 months into office would, in the heat of the moment, fold to military intelligence advisors and send in the Essex aircraft carrier, starting a ground war. Jack said later, "They thought I'd send in the Essex, and they thought wrong." Dulles and Bissell tried to get him to go to war, and he fired them both. Afterwards, Jack said he wanted, quote, to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, unquote. The basic facts of the Cuban Missile Crisis are well known. In October 1962, an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba. Jack placed a naval blockade around the island to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. After 13 days of tension, Jack and Khrushchev publicly agreed that the Soviets would dismantle the weapon sites in exchange for a pledge that the United States not invade Cuba. The US also secretly agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, missiles which Jack had already ordered the Defense Department to dismantle 3 times. My father later said that 8 of the 13 members of the XCOM wanted an invasion or an air attack until the bitter end. We now know that the Russian commanders of all those missile sites had authorization to launch if they felt themselves threatened, and that at least 70 million Americans would have died instantaneously. Jack told Daddy we could take 1 Bay of Pigs, but if we had 3, we would have a coup d'etat. During the 13 days, their hold on power seemed increasingly tenuous as generals and the intelligence apparatus became overtly rebellious and insubordinate. At the boiling point, Jack instructed the Navy to stay away from Cuba to avoid risking an accidental provocation. Admiral George Anderson promptly violated Jack's order by sending ships near the Cuban shore and made his deputy, Tommy Powers, without presidential authority, elevate alert levels to DEFCON 2, 1 step below full nuclear war, and broadcast that provocation to the Russians. The CIA, in direct disobedience to presidential directive, dropped 60 elite commandos into Cuba to prepare the ground for the invasion they hoped would follow. Daddy went through the roof when he learned of the incidents of insubordination. Bill Harvey, the CIA officer who green-lighted the commandos, called Jack's unwillingness to launch quote unquote treasonous. Incensed brass were in the state of disbelief at what they considered bald treachery by the country, to our country by the president. And Admiral George Anderson screamed at Daddy, "We have been had." Pentagon defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who years later leaked the Pentagon Papers, described the atmosphere in Arlington at the Pentagon. He said, quote, "There was virtually a coup atmosphere in Pentagon circles. Spoiling for war to end all wars, LeMay found consolation by allowing himself to believe all was not lost. Why don't we go in there on Monday and make a strike anyway? LeMay ventured hopefully as he watched the crisis subside. We lost, he fulminated. We ought to have gone in there and knocked them off. Jack graciously hosted a White House reception for the Joint Chiefs in a magnanimous gesture to thank them and share with them some of the undeserved credit for successful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Joint Chiefs rejected the olive branch, and an insubordinate LeMay raged at Jack in public, "It's the greatest defeat in our history. We should invade today." Weeks later, still boiling, he complained to the chiefs bitterly, "We had a chance to throw the communists out of Cuba, but the administration was scared to death that the Russians might shoot a missile at us." Nixon publicly chimed in with the diehard wingnuts, condemning Jack for pulling defeat out of the jaws of victory. Reflecting on the Berlin crisis, Vietnam, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is terrifying to consider how close we came to indeed making this the last generation of mankind. Our world was saved again and again by leaders who listened carefully to advisors but acted independently, who were willing to consider war but were committed to peace. Leaders who had the courage to stand up to the Pentagon, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, and who had the sensitivity to understand the plight of their enemies. Leaders whose judgment was sound, whose imagination soared, and who spoke truth to power. Daddy was touched by the many people who said that with Jack's assassination, so died their hope. But he did not share that sentiment. He said, we must learn the lessons from Jack's life, had to teach us and model our own actions after the best of Jack's. And those men in their commitment recall Stephen Spencer's famous lines. I think continually of those who are truly great, the names of those who in their lives fought for life, who swore at their hearts the fire's center. Born of the sun, they traveled a short while towards the sun and left the vivid air signed with their honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, every time I get a chance to see this speech, and even having the opportunity after I had seen it before to reread the transcript, you know, I'm struck by one part in particular. And I'll paraphrase here, but that's when President Kennedy talks about that many people think that it's an unreal belief to think that peace is even possible. And when we think about our world today, the level of divisiveness, division, strife, war, in so many different places, including in our own democracy, many people think that true peace is impossible. But I'm on President Kennedy's side. I believe it is very possible. President Kennedy goes on to say that it's a man-made problem, so therefore men and women can solve it. And I truly believe that. And he does use the word belief. And I think that word is so powerful and relevant right now. There's so many people that don't really believe anymore. The level of cynicism, the level of vitriol, the level of lies, and people having their own facts and spreading of misinformation to manipulate beliefs has happened. It's happened before, but it's happened in a bigger and more broad way now by using technology. And that's why we're using technology, just to have this conversation, to reach more people through this. And it's by having these types of conversations and by watching a speech like that and understanding that we've been here before and we can solve where we are. We can bring our democracy back. We can have peace in the world in so many difficult places if we truly understand what empathy means. As Dr. King would put it, what love means. You know, when you think about love, when you think about President Kennedy, you think about Bobby Kennedy, all of these things are inextricably linked, and we're dealing with similar things right now.
Gillian, let's start with you. You served as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, an organization founded to advance peace. There are 32 ongoing conflicts in the world today. Talk about how people tuning in today can bolster the efforts of the United Nations to create a more peaceful world.
Well, first, thank you, Carrie, for such a comprehensive and very powerful and moving presentation. It brings that history right back to the front of our eyes, and it's so fascinating to hear that. As for the United Nations, which is now 77 years old, it was born immediately following World War II. It now has 190 members. It is today the only universal organization. Everyone is present, large countries and small. Everyone has a voice, not just the great powers, but the small powers who also have much to contribute. So I feel it plays a very important role in bringing us together. This venue here in New York is where leaders from all over the world can meet and do. And as for peacekeeping, of course, it's difficult, but the United Nations peacekeepers over the years have done a great many missions in all difficult parts of the world and resolved situations time and again. I do think the UN gets more credit for its humanitarian work, health, safe birth, sufficient food and support for the rights of women and girls, and on an issue important to me, support for refugees. But the peacekeeping role has been important all these years. I would add just one other thing, and that is that the United States has always been supportive of UN peacekeeping, but we never give American soldiers to it. We give transport, we give materiel, and we have a few senior officials in the overall advisory group, but we do not send American soldiers. So they come often from smaller countries. I know there are criticisms of the UN, but I think it's a unique institution, imperfect, but invaluable.
Thank you. Thank you. And Jeb, just thinking about all those wars that are happening, of course, you mentioned Ukraine, but there are so many others in the world today. And you have really committed yourself to the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you talk about a little bit about the connections between conflict, armed conflict, and attainment of those goals?
Well, when we're fighting, we're not achieving any goals. We're just destroying. So this is the greatest diversion of focus, attention, financial resources, human resources imaginable. I think probably our most scarce resource in the world is attention. So there's no attention to things that really matter: ending poverty, safe water, having children in school, climate change. These are not even seriously discussed in international fora right now. Now, you might think they are, they're not. What's really discussed is war. And I think, Carrie, you also made very powerful points that are completely true today. Our politics is dominated by warmongers, by generals who know how to fight or want to fight, by politicians who pipe off. President Kennedy saved the world not mainly by listening to advisors, but mainly by not listening to them, because the real history of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that almost no advisors gave him the path to peace. The overwhelming echo chamber was just to bomb and when to bomb. And you also said something that I hadn't thought about that I think is probably true also. President Biden pulled the US out of Afghanistan in 2021. I think it was the right thing to do, though a little chaotic how it happened. But he was called weak, He was put on the defensive. And I think the attitude since then towards negotiations has been, unfortunately, the one driven by warmongering and by the military-industrial complex and all the rest. So there's a certain analogy also with the Cuban Missile Crisis following the Bay of Pigs. You know, the pressure after Bay of Pigs, which President Kennedy, of course, didn't like, resisted, was thrown onto his lap in the first days of the administration. He sensed it would be a debacle, and it was a debacle, but it added to the pressures that could have ended the world. And the job of a president in the United States, the main job is to know how to keep the foot on the brakes, because we have a revving war machine all the time. We have a military-industrial complex. We have a rhetoric of war. We have a rhetoric of arrogance all the time. And only the greatest presidents, and President Kennedy is certainly among the very few great presidents, knew how to keep the foot on the brake. And that's, I hadn't heard about his wanting his epitaph to read, "He kept the peace," but he did. And he knew how big the pressures were around him to do the opposite, to do the wrong thing. This is the situation that we're in right now. We have drumbeats of war. My experience in more than 30 years of engagement with Russia and Ukraine, advising both countries from their first days of independence, is that we could have peace in this war too, if we sit down to negotiate. But everyone says, no, 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 don't negotiate. That's why I really want us to listen to President Kennedy, to say that it's practicable, that we can reach peace, and let us never fear to negotiate.
Thank you. I'd love to ask both of you, who do you think is doing it right these days? Is there a country, is there a leader who you admire? Maybe it's not the usual European and US context, but someplace anywhere in the world who you think has really done extraordinary work in creating peace and keeping peace.
I think it's interesting that this has prompted Sweden and Finland to want to join NATO. And that's in Finland's already there. Sweden will probably be there this summer. That makes a large conglomerate of European nations speaking together. And in my view, this should not be a fight between the US and Russia. It should be NATO, and we should speak with and through NATO and all of those kindred powers. So I respect the Swedish and Finnish leadership for stepping up in that way.
I wonder what Jeff has to say about it.
Yeah,
I don't think NATO is Jeff's favorite organization.
No, not at all. NATO would have done a good job to be superseded by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, at the end of the Cold War. I think it would have been more peaceful for everybody and more secure for everybody. But the countries, what's happened is we are entering two dangerously divided camps: the so-called West, which is the US-led alliance, and we push it as a Chinese-led alliance. Well, I think this is a dangerous self-fulfilling prophecy if we view things that way. I do think most of the world overwhelmingly wants the US and Russia, that means President Biden, President Putin, to sit down and negotiate, which they haven't done. They haven't even talked once, not even once. Maybe they're writing secret communications, but I doubt it somehow. They haven't spoken once since this war started. And what I hear, and from people that I very much admire, like President Lula in Brazil, is that the two sides should talk. And I think that this is really crucial. So, of course, I believe Pope Francis has given us a magnificent road to cooperation also in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. It's, I would say, the spiritual counterpart to President Kennedy's speech, because what Fratelli Tutti is about encountering the other, the one that you wouldn't expect, the one that you wouldn't otherwise talk to. The Samaritan, which in biblical times meant someone outside the Jewish community. That was Christ's message about the Good Samaritan, was that was a Samaritan on the side of the road. Yet the Samaritan, I'm sorry, helped. And that was an outsider to our community who helped. So the idea of Pope Francis is encounter the other. We should be sitting with President Xi. We should be sitting with President Putin. We should be sitting with all other world leaders to negotiate, to discuss, to understand each other's points of view, to understand that our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. By the way, those are so much my favorite words, Gillian, that I actually, when I was summarizing my favorite passages of the speech, I left that for the end and then forgot to come back to it. And not only, I'm glad that I did, because I learned that it's your favorite part also, but I recite those words everywhere because they're so meaningful. That we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, which is even more pertinent today in an era of climate change. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. And this is really the essence of it. And what President Kennedy was saying so powerfully is people everywhere want peace. That is the building block for really achieving it, that people everywhere want peace.
Thank you, Jeff. I would just point out that the two sides in this war are Ukraine and Russia. So Zelensky is the person who needs it to be at the table, not just the US and Russia, but Zelensky and the people of Ukraine, because they're the ones who are on the front line, and they're the ones whose country has been invaded. Gillian, we have, I think, time for just a few closing words. Is there something you would like to add before we wrap it up?
Thank you, Carrie. Just the sense that the power of words is absolutely unlimited. Words, not just what we say, but how we say it, how to inform, how to inspire, how to encourage, how to give hope. And we need leaders who can do that, sometimes through diplomacy in more formal settings, but also through our relations with our state and even our local leaders to make peace happen. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said peace begins in small ways close to home. That's one way to start, but just to give the sense that all of us are involved and have a contribution to make.
I love that, because it's so easy to read that speech or hear that speech and think this is all about somebody more powerful than me or stronger than me, or this is just only about world leaders. But it really, there's a lot of lessons in there for how we treat each other as a nation in our very, very divided nation today, and how we treat our brothers and sisters and those in our own community.
Carrie, could I
Jeffrey,
chime in just on that point?
Yes, please.
You know, in the close of the peace speech, President Kennedy says, "Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude toward peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad." And what's really remarkable and wonderful, and I hope people will afterwards go listen, is the very next day after the peace speech, the greatest speech a president ever gave about peace. President Kennedy delivered the most remarkable speech on June 11, 1963, on civil rights. Back to back, 2 days. President Kennedy, Ted Sorensen wrote the most important, moving words about peace and about civil rights, basically in a stretch of 48 hours delivered. And so it's a back-to-back message. And what you were both reminding and what President Kennedy said is these weren't two different topics. These were deeply interrelated topics. Peace globally and peace at home.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And that's absolutely right. That was true then, and it's true today. I'll just ask Gillian to hold up Jeff's book once more. And I'd say for everybody in the audience, if you want to learn more about this, go buy Jeff's book. It is a fantastic read. You'll learn all you need to know right there. And thank you again to Howard and Lori and to everybody for tuning in today. Good. Okay,
Howard,
Howard,
you're on mute, Howard. the words of our age.
And so in conclusion, we want to thank Gillian Sorensen. We want to thank Kerry Kennedy and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs and Hill Harper for a most extraordinary session. New Democratic Dimensions was formed 40 years ago. And well, this is part of a series, and the purpose was really independent thinking Democrats talking about America and talking both locally and globally, leadership, democracy, freedom, and uplifting of all. That's what we're concentrating on and having a series such as this. And I want to just say thank you to Oscar Torres, if you'd come on the screen for a second, a member of our board who provided the Zoom and produced this, an extraordinary individual, and we thank you for that. Lori, if you would give us a few closing remarks, and then I have one comment to conclude.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you to all of our panel members. This has been such a privilege. One of the things that really struck me in today's forum is recognizing how President Kennedy knew that peace is too important to be left to the generals or the intelligence experts. He knew that peace cannot be a gift. It is a labor. It is a building process. It is something that engages the best of us, oftentimes under the worst of conditions. And so I agree. Let's read Jeff's book. Let's go back to the initial speech and let's find ways to bring this wisdom in today's world and to continue this process, this imperative of building the path to peace.
And I want to make a reading of President Kennedy as we come to this, and also comment, Gillian, and I don't know if you know this, but we had Ted speak many years ago. And one of the things that he said is he hoped that in terms of our name, that we would be a new dimension. We can only hope in terms of the future, that in terms of peace and freedom, that we can help in terms of that. John Kennedy, in his words, in the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the right to defend freedom in its moment of maximum danger. I welcome it. And I'm going to ask, Hill, if you wouldn't mind, if you would take that as just for a few minutes a going off point for some of your thoughts in terms of bringing peace and freedom to the world. Hill?
You know, when I think of the totality of the speech, and I think of some of the most powerful quotes and some of the most powerful lines, What it simply reminds me of is our most precious, but often most misused resource, and that's time. We don't have any more time to allow hate. We don't have any more time to allow war. We don't have any more time to allow for killing, racism, misogyny. We don't have any more time to allow anything that involves the persecution, enslavement, or injury of another human being. We have to have a no tolerance policy. And in so keeping with President Kennedy's words, if we all understand that we are all tied together in a single garment of mutual destiny, as Dr. King says, that my destiny is inextricably linked with yours, and you may be watching this on your cell phone, and we may never meet in person, but we're still inextricably linked. And you may be watching this in Europe, you may be watching it in Africa, you may be watching it in South America, you may be watching it as you're in your home in the US or in North America. And you may not have melanin in your skin like I do, or you may have a lot of curl in your hair like I do, or you may not, but we are all inextricably linked. And then until we actually start demanding change from our elected officials to see our common humanity, until we start electing people to office that celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in the process, then we will continue to tear each other down. And we don't have time for that anymore, because we will ultimately destroy our democracy and we will destroy ourselves. So let's find a way to work together. I'm going to do my best as we lead into the future to lean in even harder, to do more, to participate in even more. And I will say this, as uncomfortable as it may seem, if you've ever thought to run for office, I don't care if it's school board, I don't care if it's PTA, I don't care if it's library, I don't care what it is, city council, mayor, governor, senator, Congress, run. We need new voices in office. We can't have the same people there anymore. We need new leadership that understands that the more people participate, the more we come out with a better result, rather than figuring out barriers to entry and creating lobbyists and money and big corporate interests that stops people from participating. This idea that only incumbents should be holding office needs to stop. Let's work together. Let's find new pathways for service, and let's continue to fight, because only through fighting will we emerge victorious. Thank you for this. I'm so inspired by this discussion of what we've had and where we're headed. God bless.
Thank you, Hill, for those words, and thank you all for participation. It's an important time for us to look back, look forward, and bring this into America right now in terms of our thinking and in terms of our actions. There's no reason that we can't live up to the great words of our President Kennedy in our future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.